Kang-jin had built an empire in control, but the woman he married was the only person in his life who already knew his secret. The photograph hidden in his book proved it. She was his wife in name, his problem in practice, and the one person in his empire he could not predict. When she finally acted, even he didn't see it coming. He had controlled everything, every room, every outcome, every silence, until the moment she stopped waiting for him to decide what she was worth. She was brought into his world as an afterthought. She will leave it having changed everything about him. When a man built entirely from control meets a woman who has already decided she will not be controlled, who will move first, and what would it cost them? There was no noise, just a room that breathed differently when he entered it. The penthouse at the top of the Jongno Tower did not feel like a home. It felt like a decision. Every surface was chosen for precision. Every shadow sat where it was placed. The kind of space that told you immediately that the man who occupied it did not make mistakes. Kang-jin stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with his back to the room, the way a man stands when he already owns everything in it. Seoul spread out beneath him, bright, indifferent, perfectly controlled. Like him, he did not hear her enter. He never did. Sarah set her bag down without a sound. 3 weeks in this apartment, and she had learned its rhythms the way she learned every new environment, by watching, by mapping, by understanding what each silence meant before anyone bothered to explain. Sarah set her bag down without a sound. 3 weeks in this apartment, and she had learned its rhythms the way she learned every new environment, by watching, by mapping, by understanding what each silence meant before anyone bothered to explain it. She had learned that Kang-jin's silence meant power. She had also learned that silence could be answered with silence. She was not afraid of him. That was the first thing everyone noticed about her, and the thing none of them understood. His inner circle read her composure as naivety, a foreign wife who didn't yet know what she had married into. They were wrong. When Kang-jin finally turned from the window, he found her already watching him. Not pleading, not afraid, just looking. With the particular stillness of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. Something shifted in his expression. Brief, almost invisible, not anger, not indifference, something closer to recognition, as though for the first time in years the most powerful man in Seoul had encountered something he could not simply control. He would spend the next 3 months trying. He would not succeed. The elevator did not announce itself. It arrived in silence, opened in silence, and deposited her into a hallway so still that Sarah's first breath felt like a trespass. She did not hesitate at the threshold. That was the first thing she had promised herself that. Whatever this place was, whatever it had been built to communicate, she would not let it see her flinch. The hallway stretched ahead of her like a sentence that hadn't finished yet. Pale stone underfoot, walls the color of something between gray and ash. The kind of space designed to make a person feel the specific weight of being watched, even when no one was visible. No one greeted her. A staff member, expressionless, efficient, the particular blankness of someone trained not to see anything worth remembering, collected her bag and moved without speaking toward the far end of the hall. Sarah followed. That was all she was given, a direction and a silence to walk through. The room was immaculate. Of course it was. Everything she had seen in the past 20 minutes had been immaculate. The lobby downstairs, the elevator with its brushed steel and absence of fingerprints, the hallway with its surgical quiet. This was not a home. It was a demonstration. A demonstration of what exactly Sarah was still deciding. Power. That was the obvious reading. The entire penthouse exhaled wealth and authority the way certain men exhaled cologne, deliberately, thoroughly, in every direction. But there was something else beneath it. Something more considered. This was not the space of a man who wanted you to know he was rich. This was the space of a man who wanted you to know he did not need you to know. She set her single bag on the floor beside the bed without opening it. Then she stood at the window. Seoul spread out 42 floors below her, indifferent and luminous, a city that had not noticed her arrival and would not notice anything she did inside these walls. That thought did not frighten her. It steadied her. She had spent most of her life being underestimated by spaces that were not built for her. She had learned to treat that as an advantage. She had not seen him yet. That was intentional, his, not hers. She understood that much already. A man who controlled everything down to the temperature of a room did not forget to be present for someone's arrival. He had chosen not to be. He had chosen to let the apartment speak for him, Let the silence and the precision and the unmistakable message of the space land on her before he did. She had understood the message. She simply wasn't moved by it. The staff member had retreated. The door was closed. Sarah remained at the window, her reflection a faint suggestion in the glass, dark eyes steady, posture unchanged, the particular stillness of someone who has been in difficult rooms before and learned that the room is never actually the danger. The danger is always the person waiting just outside it. She felt him before she heard anything. That was the only way to describe it. A shift in the quality of the air just beyond the closed door. A pressure that had not been there 20 seconds ago. He was in the hallway. She knew it the way you know when the temperature of a room has dropped, not by measuring it, but by the way your body responds before your mind catches up. She did not turn around. This, too, was a decision. She was full of quiet decisions this evening, each one small, each one deliberate, each one part of a longer calculation she had begun before she ever stepped into his elevator. She was not performing calm. She simply understood something that the people in his orbit had apparently forgotten was possible, that his silence was a language, and she had already been fluent in difficult languages for a very long time. Let him look. She heard nothing. No footstep, no breath, no creak of a door or shift of a handle, but she knew with absolute certainty that he was still there, watching, trying to understand what she was. She stayed at the window until the city below her shifted from dusk into the first hours of dark. And when she finally turned, slowly, without urgency, with the expression of someone who has just finished making a private decision, the hallway was empty. But the door was not fully closed. It had been left open by exactly 1 inch. Sarah looked at that inch for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself the smallest curve of a smile. The hallway that narrowed near his study as though the architecture itself was warning her back. The way conversation in certain rooms stopped precisely 1 beat before she entered. No one said, "Do not go there." No one had to. The penthouse had its own grammar, and Sarah had spent the first 48 hours reading it the way she had always read unfamiliar places. Not for what they showed her, but for what they were carefully arranging not to. She agreed to all of it. Agreed, without being asked, without confrontation, without giving anyone in this building the satisfaction of watching her push against a boundary and find it firm. She moved through the allowed spaces with the same composure she had brought with her on the elevator, unhurried, deliberate, the particular stillness of a woman who was not exploring a cage. She was memorizing a map. There was a difference. She needed them to keep missing it. By the 4th day, she knew the schedule of every staff member in the building. By the 6th, she understood the weight distribution of silence in the penthouse, which silences meant Kang-jin was present, which meant he was occupied, which meant he was listening from a room she couldn't see. His dangerous obsession with control had a rhythm. Most powerful men did. They confused routine with safety, and that confusion was always, eventually, the thing that made them readable. She was not in a hurry. She trusted patience. Patience was the one form of power no one ever thought to guard against, because it looked, from the outside, exactly like surrender. She had not entered his study. She hadn't needed to. The study's closed door told her more than the room itself could have. The way he left it, always locked, but the key kept not on his person, she'd noticed, but in the left drawer of the console near the kitchen, told her something about how he balanced security against habit. He was disciplined, but comfort had made him predictable in small ways. It always did. She found it on the 7th day, in a book she had not been meant to touch. The shelves in the sitting room were the only space in the penthouse that felt inhabited rather than curated, spines not perfectly aligned. One volume pulled slightly forward, as though recently replaced without care. That small imperfection was the only one she had found in 7 days. She had been waiting for it. The photograph was tucked between pages 40 and 41. Sarah looked at it for a long time without moving. She had been wrong about one thing, just one. But it was the thing everything else had been built on. The photograph was of a woman Sarah did not recognize. Young. Laughing, genuinely, unguardedly, the way people only laugh when they believe no one is watching. Kang-jin was beside her, and he was not the man Sarah had spent 7 days studying. He was not controlled. He was not precise. He was not the immovable architecture of a man who had built himself into a fortress and sealed the doors. He was just present, unguarded, almost unrecognizable. Sarah turned the photograph over. One word was written on the back, in handwriting that was not his. A name. And beneath it, in the same ink, two words that changed the entire shape of everything Sarah thought she had understood about why she was here. Find her. In the moment, he was simply a man who looked at her the way certain men look at objects that have been placed somewhere inconvenient, not with hostility exactly, but with the particular dismissal of someone who has decided, in under 3 seconds, that her presence required no further consideration. He had addressed her in Korean, knowing she would not follow all of it. His name was Min Seo, and he had been with Kang-jin's organization for 6 years. Sarah learned this later. The words were not the insult. The tone was. The slight turn of his body away from her mid-sentence was. The way he continued his conversation with Kang-jin across her as though she were furniture that had learned to stand upright, that was. Sarah had kept her expression unchanged. She was practiced at that. What happened next took 4 seconds. Kang-jin stopped speaking, not dramatically, not with visible anger. He simply stopped. The way a room stops when the temperature drops without warning. Min Seo, mid-sentence, registered at half a beat too late. He finished his sentence into a silence so complete it had texture. Kang-jin looked at him, not at Sarah, not toward her, not in her direction at all, with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who has just decided something and is in no particular rush to announce it. He ended the meeting. No explanation. No apology offered in Sarah's direction. No acknowledgement that anything had occurred. He simply closed the conversation the way you close a door, quietly, finally, without looking back. Min Seo was gone by morning. Not fired. Reassigned to the Busan office. No confrontation, no scene, no evidence. Just the clean absence of a man who had made one small mistake in a building that did not permit them. Sarah noticed. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and registered the absence the way you register a missing tooth with your tongue, precisely, without drawing attention to the motion. She said nothing. He had protected her in the only language he apparently spoke. Action without admission. Consequence without confession. She thought about the photograph for a long time that afternoon. About the woman in it, laughing. About the 2 words written on the back, find her, and everything they implied about why Sarah was here, and what Kang-jin had needed badly enough to build this strange, cold arrangement around. She thought about the way he had shut down that meeting without once looking at her. The way the absence of his gaze had felt, somehow, more deliberate than attention would have. In this high-stakes romance she had not agreed to and could not yet name, there was a man who expressed everything through consequence and nothing through language, who protected without proximity, who felt, she was increasingly certain, more than the architecture of this apartment had been built to contain. She could not tell him what she had found in the book, not yet, but she could answer him in his own vocabulary. At 11:47, she made tea, not for herself. The cup she set outside his study door was precise. The right temperature, the right kind, placed where he would find it without tripping over it, without it being in his path, without it demanding to be acknowledged. It was, she thought, the smallest possible sentence in the language he had been speaking to her all week. Not a question, not a declaration, just, I see you. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. At 2 in the morning, she woke without knowing why. The penthouse was quiet, the specific quiet of a building that has settled into its own weight. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself. Then she noticed the light, thin, gold, bleeding under his study door and across the dark hallway floor. He was still in there, or he had gone in after she left the tea. She had no way to know which. She stared at that line of light for a long time in the dark, her chest doing something she did not immediately have a name for. The cup, she realized, was gone from the hallway. He had taken it inside. She had been 11 years old the first time she understood that being underestimated was a resource. Her mother had taught her that, without meaning to. Had taught her by moving through rooms that were not designed for her, rooms in 4 different countries across Sarah's childhood. She had been fluent in 4 languages and conversational in 2 more. She had learned to read a room's power structure within 60 seconds of entering it. She had learned to become, when necessary, entirely forgettable. The arrangement that had brought her to this penthouse was not the first arrangement she had accepted from people who believed they were in control of the terms. It was simply the first one that had surprised her. She had known about Kang-jin before she arrived. Not everything, No one knew everything about a man who had spent 15 years ensuring that the distance between his public architecture and his actual interior was unmeasurable. But enough. His organization mistook for personal weakness, and that Sarah read immediately as the truest thing about him. The photograph confirmed it. The woman in it, laughing, unguarded, was not an affair. Sarah had known that the moment she turned the photograph over and read those two words. This was not a dangerous obsession. This was a wound. And the man who had built an empire of silence around himself had apparently decided, at some point, that the wound needed to be found before it could be closed. That was why she was here. Not as a wife. Not as a liability to be managed. As a resource he didn't yet know how to use. The question she had been living inside for 10 days was not whether she could help him. She could. That much was already clear. She had skills precisely suited to finding people who did not want to be found, in a high-stakes romance of competing silences where neither party had yet admitted what they were actually asking of the other. She had the particular talent of moving through guarded worlds without triggering the instinct that makes guarded people close themselves further. She was, by training and temperament, the exact instrument this situation required. The question was whether to tell him, whether to reveal, to a man who expressed care through the quiet removal of people who had disrespected her and left her tea inside a room he had never permitted her to enter, that she had walked through his door already knowing the shape of what he needed, and had been deciding, since day one, whether he had earned the right to receive it. She had not yet decided. But she was closer than she had been yesterday. That evening, she opened her laptop for the first time since her arrival, something she had deliberately delayed, wanting to establish her rhythms here before introducing anything that might be noticed and logged. She opened a single encrypted file, looked at it for a long time without touching the keyboard. It contained everything she had gathered before she arrived. Names, locations, a network of connections so carefully obscured that 3 separate organizations had already spent years failing to trace it. She had traced it in 11 weeks. Somewhere in that file was the woman from the photograph. She was almost certain. She closed the laptop without accessing the file. Not yet. She needed one more thing from him first, not information, not permission, something harder to give. She needed to know if he was the kind of man worth trusting with the truth about what she actually was. She heard the elevator at 12:43. Not the doors, those were near silent, engineered into discretion, the way everything in this building was engineered into discretion. What she heard was the quality of the air changing. The specific pressure of his presence arriving in the floor below before any door opened, any footstep registered. She had been reading for 2 hours without retaining a single sentence. She set the book down. The negotiation had gone badly. She did not know the details yet, but she had learned to read the particular frequency of his silences the way you learn to read weather, not by waiting for the storm, but by what happens to the light an hour before it arrives. He had been tense when he left. What came through the door at 12:43 was something heavier than tension, something with edges. He did not go directly to his study. That was the first thing she registered, the deviation. She heard him stop somewhere near the kitchen, a long pause, then footsteps again, slow this time, without direction, the kind of movement that is not going somewhere but simply continuing. He appeared in the doorway of the sitting room at 12:48. He looked at her. Not the way he usually looked at her. The controlled, measuring observation she had catalogued across 14 days, the gaze of a man conducting perpetual inventory of a situation he intended to fully understand. This was different. This was a man who had just spent 3 hours in a room where his control had not been enough, and who had, without seeming to intend it, ended up standing in the one room in the penthouse where someone was still awake. Sarah did not move. Did not adjust her posture, reach for her book, or offer any of the social gestures that would have allowed him to retreat back into formality. She simply remained exactly as she was, eyes on him. The silence between them had texture now. It was no longer the calibrated silence of the first 2 weeks, the silence of 2 people maintaining studied distance in a shared space. This was closer to the silence that exists between 2 people who have been circling a particular truth long enough that the air around it has changed consistency. She knew about the photograph. She knew about the wound beneath this empire and the missing woman at its center, and the impossible request written in someone else's handwriting on the back of a buried image. She knew things about this man that he did not know she knew. And she had been carrying that knowledge carefully, waiting, as her mother had taught her to wait for the moment that was exactly right. She looked at him in the doorway, the lines of his face drawn tighter than she had seen them, the controlled posture carrying tonight the faint architecture of exhaustion beneath it. She did not offer sympathy. She did not name what she saw. "Are you hurt?" Not what happened. Not, "Are you all right?" The social reflex, the comfortable distance of general concern. That asked about his body before his composure. That treated him not as the impenetrable architecture of a Korean mafia boss, but as a person who was standing in her doorway at 12:48 looking like something had gotten through. She watched him absorb the question. Watched the slight shift across his expression. Not surprise, exactly, because she had come to understand that he processed everything through a layer of control too deep for surprise to surface cleanly. But something. A fractional recalibration. The expression of a man who had been prepared for many things tonight. His dangerous obsession with control, the one she had been reading for 2 weeks, mapping its pressure points and its fault lines, flickered. Just once, just enough. He said, "No," one word, his voice level giving nothing away in tone. And yet the answer itself was a kind of fracture, because he had answered. In 14 days and a high-stakes romance conducted entirely in deliberate silence and misdirection, and carefully placed cups of tea, he had answered a direct personal question with a direct personal response, and neither of them could pretend that was nothing. He did not leave the room. That was the thing that changed everything. He could have the answer had been given, the interaction technically complete, the script of their strange, forbidden love providing him a clean exit he was absolutely capable of taking. He did not take it. Instead, after a pause that lasted long enough for Sarah to feel her own heartbeat in it, he moved to the chair on the other side and sat down. Not close, not crowding her, just present, in the room. In the low gold light, with the city silent 42 floors below them and the space between them charged with every word neither of them had said across 2 full weeks. He reached for nothing. He offered nothing. He simply settled into the chair with the particular stillness of a man who has, for the first time in a very long time, decided not to be somewhere alone. Sarah did not speak. She picked up her book. She did not read a single word of it, but she did not put it down either. And the room, which had been many things across 14 days, became, quietly, without announcement, without either of them nomming it, something it had not been before. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, routed through 3 intermediaries in the way that messages from that particular organization always arrived, carefully, plausibly deniably, with the precise weight of a threat that could not be called a threat in any room with a recording device. Kang-jin read it once. Set it down. Read it again, not because he had missed anything the first time, but because some information requires a second pass for the body to absorb what the mind has already processed. His face did not change. His hands did not change. The room continued at its ordinary temperature. Her name was in the second paragraph. That was the part that required the second reading, not because he was surprised, because he had known it was coming and knowing had not made it smaller. He did not tell her. That decision was made before he had finished the message, with the cold efficiency that belonged to the part of him that had been running this organization for 15 years, the part that assessed, categorized, and moved. Telling her would require him to explain things that could not be explained without revealing the shape of what she had become to him, which was a shape he had not yet allowed himself to examine directly. So instead he acted, as he always acted, through consequence. By Wednesday morning, the guard rotation outside the penthouse had changed. By Thursday, the 2 staff members whose routes overlapped with the building's least monitored corridor had been quietly reassigned to other floors. By Friday, the car that brought her groceries arrived from a different direction at a different hour, and the driver was someone whose loyalty Kang-jin had tested in environments considerably more difficult than this one. He made none of these changes visibly. He left no trail of instruction that could be questioned or traced. This was the Mafia boss story told in its purest form, not violence, not confrontation, but the invisible restructuring of a world around a single point that needed protecting. Sarah noticed the guard change on Wednesday morning before she had finished her coffee. She cataloged it without expression, the way she cataloged everything, filed it, cross-referenced it against the previous rotation pattern she had memorized in the first week, noted the deviation. By Thursday, she had mapped 4 distinct alterations to the building's daily architecture. By Friday, when the grocery car arrived from the north instead of the east, she sat with that single changed detail for a long time and felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear, something adjacent to it. The recognition of danger, yes, but beneath that, and more unsettling, the recognition of what his response to that danger meant. This high-stakes romance of parallel silences had just acquired a new and specific weight. He was afraid of losing her, not the arrangement, not the leverage she represented or the access she provided or the convenient cover her presence offered in certain social contexts. Her. She understood exactly what she was holding. Man of dangerous obsession and absolute control had quietly rearranged his entire world around keeping her safe, without once telling her she was in danger, without once asking for her compliance, without once acknowledging that the forbidden love taking shape in the low-lit rooms of his penthouse had become something he was now making organizational decisions to protect. She sat with that knowledge the way you sit with something that has permanently changed the shape of a room. That evening, she made 3 phone calls. Not from her personal phone. She had never used her personal phone for anything she did not want observed, a habit so deeply ingrained it had long since ceased to feel like caution and simply felt like breathing. She used the secondary line she had kept dormant since her arrival, rooted through a server in a city that bore no relationship to Seoul, and she spoke in a language that was not among the 6 Kang-jin's organization had thought to account for when they reviewed her file. The calls were short. She asked 3 questions. She received 3 partial answers and 1 piece of information she had not had before: a city, a date, a name that connected to the name on the back of the photograph like a key fitting a lock she had been staring at for 3 weeks. She closed the line and sat in the dark for a long time. Outside his study door, the light was on. It was always on now, late, the thin gold line of it across the hallway floor that she had come to think of as his version of the cup of tea she had left him. Presence acknowledged without words. He was in there managing his version of this crisis, restructuring his organization around a threat he had not told her about, protecting her in the only vocabulary he had. And she was in here, in the dark, in possession of information that could end his search in a matter of weeks, information she had not yet decided to give him. The question she had been carrying since the night she found the photograph had sharpened into something with edges now. It was no longer whether to tell him. It was whether she would still be able to protect him once she did. She did not tell him she was going to move. That was the point. Not secrecy for its own sake. She had no interest in performance, in the theater of the hidden action revealed for maximum effect. It was simply that telling him would have required explaining what she was, what she had been, what she knew and had known since before she arrived at his door with 1 bag, and a calculation she had not yet finished making. And she was not ready to do that in the abstract. She had always been better at showing than explaining, so she showed him. On a Thursday morning, while Kang-jin was in a meeting she had not been invited to, and the rival organization's intermediary was moving through the city toward a scheduled exchange that would have, by Friday evening, formalized Sarah's position as a bargaining chip in someone else's high-stakes romance with power. She made 1 call, sent 2 messages, and transferred a single file to a single address. It took 11 minutes. The exchange never happened. What she had assembled in the encrypted file was not evidence in the legal sense. It was something considerably more useful, a precise map of the rival organization's financial architecture, drawn from sources they had been confident were invisible. A pattern of payments routed through 3 shell structures in 2 countries, connecting the organization's senior leadership to a set of transactions that would have been, in the right hands, profoundly inconvenient for them. Not illegal, not in any jurisdiction that would act quickly, just deeply, permanently compromising the relationships that kept that organization's leadership insulated from consequence. She had not gathered this information for this purpose. She had gathered it because information was the form her safety had always taken, in every room she had ever occupied, in every difficult world she had ever been placed into. She had simply been holding it, the way you hold a card without deciding yet whether to play it, waiting to understand the exact shape of the game. The shape had clarified on Tuesday. She had played it on Thursday. Dangerous obsession those men had with leverage dissolved in under 12 hours. because the leverage they had been planning to use had been quietly shown to cost considerably more than it could ever earn. Kang-jin found out on Friday afternoon, not from her, from his own intelligence network, which reported the rivals' sudden and unannounced withdrawal from the Thursday arrangement with the particular corporate blankness of men who have been outmaneuvered and are declining to discuss the specific mechanism. His contact delivered the information neutrally, in the way his contacts always delivered information, without interpretation, without visible curiosity, the emotional flatness of a professional who understood that reading too much into what they were told was not part of the role. Kang-jin sat with it for a long time. He was very still. Not the controlled stillness he wore in public, the architecture of command, the studied composure of a mafia boss whose organizational discipline required that his face be a closed room. This was a different stillness, the kind that happens when something has moved the foundation and the rest of the structure is taking a moment to catch up. He had been running a protection protocol for 3 weeks. He had restructured half his building's operations around a threat he had not told her about. He had been meticulous, thorough, confident, and she had resolved it before his plan had even reached its execution phase, using methods he did not have, through a network he had not known existed, in 11 minutes on a Thursday morning while he was in a meeting in the next room. He had not seen her. He had been looking directly at her for weeks, and he had not seen her. He found her in the kitchen at dusk. She was making tea, not for him this time, just for herself, the entirely ordinary motion of a woman at the end of an entirely unremarkable day. She did not look up when he entered. She did not perform calm. She was calm, the real kind, the kind that belongs to someone who has done what they set out to do and has no particular need for the acknowledgement that follows. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. The silence before he spoke lasted long enough for the kettle to begin. Then, "How long have you been watching?" 4 words again, but this time they were his. Sarah set down the kettle, turned, met his eyes directly, not with triumph, not with the visible satisfaction of someone who had been waiting to be found out, with the particular steadiness of someone who has been ready for this conversation for a very long time. "About as long as you have," she said. He did not move. The kitchen held them both in the low gold light of early evening, the city beyond the windows doing what it always did, continuing, indifferent, enormous, and for the first time in 6 weeks, neither of them reached for a silence to stand behind. He did not go back to his study after the kitchen. That in itself was a rupture. The study was the place he went to recalibrate, to close the door and sit with whatever the day had handed him until it reduced to something manageable and contained. He had been going there for 15 years, through consequences considerably louder than anything this evening had produced. It had never failed him. He could not go there tonight because the thing he needed to process was not the rival's withdrawal, not the exposed architecture of his own protection plan, not even the particular quality of skill she had demonstrated in dismantling a threat he had spent 3 weeks attempting to quietly solve. He spent the evening in the sitting room where she had asked him 23 days ago if he was hurt. He sat in the same chair. He did not turn on more lights. He let the city beyond the window do what it always did, continue without him, enormous and indifferent, and he let himself think the thought he had been organizing his entire life to not have to think, that he had built every defense, every silence, every organizational layer of controlled distance, not because emotion was liability in his mafia boss world, but because he had lost things, specific things. People who had been real and present, and then suddenly, completely, irreversibly not. He had built the fortress after the loss, not before it, and had spent so long maintaining the walls that he had forgotten what the walls were actually for. She had walked in from outside and mapped them in 6 weeks, had found the photograph, had understood the wound, had gathered 11 weeks of intelligence before she ever arrived, and then had chosen, every single day in this penthouse, to wait, to offer cups of tea instead of confrontations, to meet his silence with her own instead of forcing the conversation he had been braced for and prepared to deflect, until the moment when she moved was a moment entirely of her choosing. He had not been protecting her. He had been protecting himself. She had been protecting him. At 11:40, he stood. Not with decision, or not the kind of decision he was accustomed to making, the cold logic decisions of resource and consequence that had governed every significant choice of his adult life. This was something older and considerably less comfortable. The particular forward motion of a man who has finally run out of reasons to stay still. Her door was not locked. He had never locked it from either side. That had been its own kind of statement. He realized now, one of the first things he had done when she arrived, leaving her door unlockable in a building full of people whose access to every room he controlled precisely. He had not named that choice at the time. He named it now, standing in the corridor outside her room in the dark, and the numbing of it opened something in his chest that the study had always kept closed. He knocked once. She said, "Come in," as though she had been expecting him. As though, and this was the thought that moved through him as he opened the door, she had possibly been expecting him for some time. The room was dim. She was sitting up in bed with the lamp at its lowest setting, her book closed on the nightstand in a way that suggested it had been closed for a while. He sat down in the chair near the window. Not close, the same instinct that had kept him in the chair across the room that first night, the instinct toward proximity without presumption that had become, he understood now, the only honest vocabulary he had been able to offer her. She waited. She was so extraordinarily patient, this woman. She had always simply waited, and he had spent weeks reading that patience as composure, when what it actually was, he now understood, was grace. The silence was not waited tonight. It was different from every silence that had come before it in this apartment, not controlled, not maintained, not used as distance or communication or deflection. It was just the silence of two people sitting in the same room in the dark, both having arrived at the same place by entirely different routes. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. Then he said the truest thing he had said in longer than he could calculate. "I don't know how to do this." Sarah looked at him for a moment. Her expression was not pity. It was not the particular warmth of someone who has been waiting to comfort. She had never been performing comfort, he understood that now. It was something quieter and more permanent. Recognition meeting recognition. "I know," she said, and then, "I've been watching you figure it out." He did not move. Neither did she. Outside, Seoul continued. Between them, something that had been arriving since the night she stepped off his elevator without flinching finally, quietly, came to rest. The weeks after were quieter than either of them expected. Not the enforced quiet of before, the calibrated silence of two people maintaining careful distance in a shared space. This was different. This was the quiet that arrives when something has been resolved and the resolution has had time to become ordinary. The organization continued. The city continued. The penthouse, which had spent 6 weeks as a stage for two people conducting elaborate performances of composure, gradually became simply the place where they lived. Kang-jin did not announce the changes he made. That was not his way, and she had long since stopped expecting it to be. He simply adjusted. The staff noticed before Sarah did, the shift in how her presence was referred to in the building's logistics, the way her name appeared now in the organizational shorthand that governed the penthouse's daily life. Not as a visitor, not as an arrangement. As someone who was there the way load-bearing walls are there, structurally, permanently, not requiring discussion. She had become part of the architecture. He had simply stopped pretending she wasn't. She did not ask for promises. This, too, was a choice, deliberate, considered, the product of the same patient intelligence she had brought to every other decision she had made in this building. Promises required a man to articulate what he intended, and articulation was not yet available to him in any reliable quantity. What was available was this, the chair across from her that was now, without declaration, his chair. The cup of tea that appeared on her desk on mornings when she had slept badly and had not told anyone. The way the dangerous obsession for control that she had spent 6 weeks mapping had quietly, permanently made room for her somewhere at its center. She had not come here looking for this. Neither had he. That, she had decided, was the thing that made it real. 3 weeks after the kitchen, she gave him the file. Not the encrypted version, a printed summary, 6 pages, laid on the kitchen table one morning while he was in the shower. No presentation, no preface. When he came in and found it, she was making coffee and not watching him, which was itself a kind of permission. You do not have to respond to this in real time. You do not have to perform your reaction. Take it to your study and do with it what you need to do. He picked it up. He stood at the table and read all 6 pages without moving. When he set it down, his face was the expression she had seen only once before in the kitchen, on the night he said he didn't know how to do this. Not the controlled mask of the Mafia boss story the rest of the world had been reading for 15 years. Just a man holding something he had been trying to find for a very long time, in a room that had become, quietly and without ceremony, the only room he wanted to be in. He said, "Thank you," she said. "I know." It was sufficient. It was entirely sufficient. She did not go into his study until he gave her the key. That was the last rule, and she had kept it the way she had kept all the others, not out of submission, not out of patience performed as a strategy, but out of genuine respect for the thing the rule had always been about. The study was the place he went to be alone with what he was. She had always known that. She had always understood that walking through that door uninvited would have cost them something they could not have rebuilt. So she waited. She was good at waiting. It was, of all her skills, the one she was most grateful for. This story was never about a man with power and a woman without it. It was about two people who had both been shaped by difficult worlds into habits of silence and self-protection, and who found, in each other, the one thing neither had been able to build alone, a room they could be honest in. He learned the difference between controlling a space and trusting the person inside it. She learned that patience is not the same as passivity, and that waiting for the right moment is only possible if you know, in advance, what you are waiting for. The most powerful thing in this story was never the organization, the rivals, the architecture of threat and counter-threat. It was the cup of tea left outside a locked door. The chair across the room was chosen and returned to. The key given on a Sunday with no ceremony and everything intended. If you have ever been the quiet one in a room full of noise, the one who watched and mapped and waited, this story was for you. Your patience is not invisible. It is simply operating on a timeline that other people cannot read. And if you are the one who built the walls, the door was never actually locked. You simply forgot you were the one holding the key. The most powerful act of love is not protection. It is the willingness to see someone fully, their intelligence, their strength, their wholeness, and choose them not despite it, but because of it. Emotional restraint is not the same as emotional emptiness. The most guarded people often feel the most deeply and simply need a witness who is patient enough to wait. Strength does not always announce itself. The people most underestimated by the rooms they walk into are often the most transformative forces within them. Dear viewers, if you have ever been the person in the room who was underestimated, the one whose calm was mistaken for passivity, whose patience was mistaken for acceptance, this story is for you. Your quiet is not a weakness. Your watching is not waiting to be saved. And if you have ever been the person on the other side, the one who built their whole world around the ability to not need anyone, know this. The most courageous thing you will ever do is let someone see you before you have decided what they are allowed to see. The quiet ones are always the most interesting people in the room, and the ones who finally speak, after a long, deliberate silence, always say something that changes everything.